Good evening. We want to share that closed captioning is available by simply clicking on that CC icon you see along the bottom of your Zoom screen. A live transcript should begin immediately. We also want to remind everyone that this and all Real Talk events is being recorded and will be emailed to all registrants and uploaded to the Real Talk website at realtalklwv.org. Again, that's realtalklwv.org. Good evening again, and welcome to Real Talk's two-part racial justice series. Is Justice Truly Blind? Examining the courts for racial equity from arraignment through reentry. Tonight is part two of the two-part series, Picking Up the Pieces, Collateral Consequences and Reentry. Last week, our panelists took us through the courtroom from arraignment to sentencing, which gives us the context for tonight's discussion. If you missed the first part of the series, you can find a recording on the Real Talk website. I'll be your moderator for the evening. My name is Foluke Omosun, a reporter for WKSU and a doctoral candidate at Kent State. Before we move on, we need to thank our incredible program partners and contributors who help bring this and other critically important issues to life. Real Talk is a diversity, equity, and inclusion program that addresses life-threatening inequities and disparities in criminal justice, education, public health, housing, and democracy. Real Talk is hosted by 4 leagues of women voters in Northeast Ohio, Akron, Hudson, Greater Cleveland, and Kent, in strong partnership with the Akron NAACP, the Freedom BLOC, WKSU, and WCPN Idea Stream. As we embark on the evening, we need to stress that criminal convictions are a life sentence, even after an individual has paid their debt. With 1 in 6 Ohioans living with a criminal conviction, there are countless Ohioans struggling to rebuild their lives because of collateral consequences and sanctions. These codified sanctions severely restrict access to housing, jobs, licensure, and education. This is well after they have served their time. Tonight we'll open with 2 Ohioans who cycled through the system and hit wall after wall when rebuilding their lives. Then learn what those collateral sanctions are here in Ohio and what the actual re-entry process is, the complications, roadblocks, and dead ends, the challenges with sealing and expunging criminal records, access to housing, what type of training and employment is available in the face of those collateral sanctions, and learn about regional alternative programs and support services. Then we'll explore all of these issues together in the question and answer segment. Be sure to drop your questions in the chat box and Q&A box throughout the evening for the panel to address. Finally, we'll end with what you can do to help make a difference. So let's get started. Our opening speakers will kick off the program by sharing their personal stories about the real impact of incarceration and the challenges of reentry. Our first speaker is Reverend Ray Greene Jr. He is the Executive Director of the Freedom BLOC, the Founding Director of the Freedom Rock, and Co-Founding Director for Black Folk Strategies. He has been an organizer and electoral operative in Ohio for more than 15 years. His work includes founding grassroots organizations such as My Brother's Keeper in Northeast Ohio, focusing on training and supporting formerly incarcerated men, and serving as a pastor of a local church. He has held multiple organizing and campaign roles for the Ohio Organizing Collaborative and Stand Up for Ohio. He holds an associate's degree in pastoral studies from Ohio Christian University and a bachelor's degree in substance abuse and mental health counseling. Thank you, Reverend Greene, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Foluke. Welcome to all of our panelists and all of our guests. I hope this is informative for you. As she said, I am Ray Greene, the Executive Director of the Freedom BLOC, and I encountered this system at a young age, and I have matriculated through basically every part of this criminal justice system, including a lot of the collateral sanctions. I began my engagement with the criminal justice system at the age of 16, where I was first arrested for drug possession. I encountered 2 more juvenile cases for drugs and for assault before graduating high school and becoming a single father. I became a single father in February of 1994, and I graduated in June of 1994. Through having a son and trying to take care of a son and working, I realized that it wasn't it wasn't paying the bills. And in my family, you know, most of the men in my family, and for the most part, all the men in my family and most of the women sold drugs. You know, my father sold drugs, my uncle sold drugs, and it was just a common sense thing to do to be able to take care of your family. Through that, I ended up having another daughter. So now I'm 20 years old, a single father with 2 children. I have a decent job. At that time in 1996, I had a job making $12 an hour at a foundry. I'm working 60, 70 hours a week, and I'm selling drugs at work. Through that, I'm able to buy a house. In buying a house and raising kids, there came a time where I was trying to get my kids in school. I went to the HR service and asked them for, 3 days off. I had a family emergency. I needed to get my kids in school. Their mother was not babysitting no more. It's just a lot of stuff going on. And they denied me, access to be able to get my kids daycare. So I took 2 days off, got my kids in school, got my daughter daycare, went back to work on the 3rd day. I worked till lunchtime and then they fired me. So now I got 2 kids. I just bought a house and I just lost 2 major parts of my income because I was working there, making good money, and I was selling drugs there. And now I'm unemployed with 2 kids in the house and just selling drugs. Through that, I encounter my first felony as an adult, which is domestic violence. That domestic violence comes from an altercation with their mother where I never touched her, but the fact that she called the police, I went to jail. Didn't matter that I had custody of the kids, none of that mattered. I had a choice to take it to trial, which I could have got at that time. It was 6 months to 18 months, or I could have pleaded out and went home to my kids. So for me, naturally, my kids is at home, I need to plead out. Plead out, went home to my kids. But now I'm realizing like now I really can't get a job. Now I have this domestic violence on my record. And although it was a misdemeanor, like I can't get a job. And the custody of my children is in jeopardy. So I continued to sell drugs, ended up getting caught up selling drugs, got sentenced to 6 months, got a suspended sentence, was sent to drug rehab. Drug rehab was a joke. It was the biggest joke of a lifetime. It gave you no skills, no hope for rehabilitation, no nothing. And I didn't need it. What I really needed was a good paying job to take care of my families. Continued to do what I was doing. Ended up catching another domestic violence charge. Now I have 2 domestic violence charges, one which was a misdemeanor. Now the second one is a felony. And because you caught the second one as a felony, the first one becomes a felony. Now you got 2 felonies of the worst charge you can have, which is domestic violence, which further puts my kids in jeopardy. The fact that their mom was unfit, the fact that I have a support system with my mom and my sister, I was able to maintain custody of my kids. But now I have 2 felonies, 3 felonies, 2 felony domestic violences, and a felony drug charge now. And get caught again selling drugs. This time, now I'm a 4-time felon. This is my 4th felony. Rehab and programs obviously isn't working. It's how the judge is looking. He sentenced me to 3.5 years. When he sentenced me to this 3.5 years, it was a blow to my heart. Because I said I'm a single father and I'm doing everything I'm trying to do to take care of my kids. I'm trying to get assistance. I can't get assistance because they don't believe that I got custody of my kids. No matter how much paperwork, they just not believing I got custody of my kids. I can't get housing, so I'm stuck with this mortgage to make sure that my kids got a place. And now I'm about to go away for 3.5 years. Ended up reducing my sentence, suspending some sentence. I ended up with 30 days. I did 30 days in Lorraine Correctional Institution and then was sent to the Oriana house. Went to the Oriana house and realized like, oh, this is a joke. Like it was no, they sent me to timeout for anger management. That class was a joke. It didn't like touch on the things that allowed me to get well, which later on I figured out, and I went to counseling. I figured out like my anger centered from watching my mom get beat as a kid, and those were the only coping skills I had. And like I didn't get that help until I went to counseling to understand like where my anger, where my frustration stem from, and then how to deal with it in a cognitive matter. But through that, coming home and basically after losing everything, can't find housing, can't find a job, and it was just debilitating. Um, I ended up going to Family Dollar one day and buying like $30 worth of stuff and going out in the parking lot and selling it and making $100. And I fell in love with that. Um, Still couldn't get housing, but I got money to afford a place, so I moved out of Akron and moved to Dayton. Got to Dayton, couldn't find a place. I was effectively homeless for 3.5 months with 2 kids, living in hotels, showering at bus depots, um, meeting people at hotels, meeting laundry people at hotels that'll let us take a shower in the morning when they cleaning up the rooms, and just really trying to survive with my 2 kids. Finally finding a place to stay, staying in Dayton for 2 years, and then moved from Dayton to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to Detroit, where I finally moved back here in 2006. Because my kids were just tired of traveling. They wanted to be home with family. And I came back home and really just tried to start my life back over in Akron. And it was just, I just couldn't do it. Like there was no work for formerly incarcerated people still. And I just remember riding the bus one day and hearing some people on the bus talk about, man, I'm tired of putting these applications, they're not hiring us, da. And it like clicked in my head, like, oh, you're not the only one going through this. Because for the whole time I'm thinking like, this is my dark place, like nobody else is going through this. I gotta have the worst streak of luck ever. And then hearing these conversations on the bus, and it just like, it sparked something in me. I went to work that day and asked my boss, why did he hire me, knowing that I was formerly incarcerated? And he looked me dead in my face and said, that's why I hired you, because you was formerly incarcerated. And I know you're gonna be here every single day. And I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then he told me like I get this amount of money, from the state from hiring formerly incarcerated people. Y'all reliable, y'all come to work, that's why I hired you. So I'm like, so will you hire some, like I got some people that need some work, would you hire them? He like, well, we don't have any openings right now. Um, but if we got some openings, I'll hire anybody you send in if they're gonna work like you work. So I got back on the bus. That next day, I told the guys to go put in an application. I told them to call me as soon as they put in the application. After they put in an application, they called me. I went and worked the next day and quit. And it was like, one of these brothers need a job, man. Um, my faith in God is gonna get me through. But these brothers on their last leg. I appreciate if you hired them. And that feeling that I got from getting one of them brothers a job just took over me. I went to the Urban League and began to work with a brother by the name of Ace Epps, who was doing transition work. And he helped me formulate my program for My Brother's Keeper to help formerly incarcerated people get trained and get job development and job skills. Um, from that, I realized that it wasn't just jobs, it was policy. Um, and there was, clauses in our policy that prevented formerly incarcerated people from getting a job. That's why they asked you on the application, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And I was able to trace that back to the 13th Amendment. And this is when I just fell in love with policy. I was like, I figured out the 13th Amendment set the stage for me not getting a job, and people that look like me and my uncles who never had a job because they got caught with drugs once. Like it set the stage for us all to be in prison and all not to be able to get a job. And I began to like really work on this policy thing, which is where I ran into the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and we began to get rid of over 800 collateral sanctions. There was a time when you couldn't get a barber's license. If you had a felony, you couldn't get a nursing's license if you had a felony. And we got rid of all of those collateral sanctions. Then we worked on housing with Metropolitan Housing, subsidized housing. We worked with them to ensure that people coming home from prison are allowed to move in with loved ones who live in subsidized housing. They have to go through my program on My Brother's Keeper. They have to do volunteer work. They have to do financial training, and then if they have children, they have to go through manhood development and fatherhood training to qualify to be able to move into subsidized housing. And that's where I'm at today with the Freedom Bloc, is really fighting for housing, fighting for eliminating collateral sanctions for formerly incarcerated people, and just really fighting for the humanity of human beings that look like me, that was not considered human just yesterday. You know, we want to act like this was 400 years ago, but we have to understand when these laws were put in place, it was Abraham Lincoln at this time, and Harriet Tubman was alive at that time. When Harriet Tubman died, Ronald Reagan was president at that time. So this is yesterday. This isn't 400, 500 years ago. This is yesterday that we were not considered human beings. And those practices are still being carried out today through mass incarceration and a carceral punishment system.
Right, right. Wow. Thank you, Reverend Greene, for sharing your story with us. That was really compelling. Just a quick fact, around 1 in 4 Ohio jobs, that's about 1.3 million jobs, is blocked or restricted for those with a conviction. That's according to Policy Matters Ohio. So now we're going to move on to our next speaker, who's also going to share his personal story. Walter Mathis is an author, community organizer, and public speaker. He joined the fight for criminal justice reform in 2018 as a community organizer and spokesperson during the Issue 1 campaign. He has participated in several forums and panel discussions informing citizens of voter rights, the need for drug sentencing reform, and building a stronger, unified community. As a community organizer with the Akron Organizing Collaborative, he has worked to build stronger and safer communities. His first novel, a suspense thriller trilogy titled Iniquitous, was published in May 2018. Mr. Mathis, it's great to have you here. Oh, you're muted.
That's all right. Thank everybody for having me. I think I got my first felony in probably around 2006 or 7, but it didn't actually take effect until around 2010 because I was in the treatment and loop program, which they mentioned in part 1 of this of this segment. And I guess what happened with that was after about 18 months in the program, they kind of lost me in the system. So I didn't have a probation officer to report to or anything like that. I finished all my classes at UMADOP. So I just had to report to a judge and drop urines. And what ended up happening was I finished the program successfully, but I still got the felony because they said I started failing drug tests. But they never found anything in my urine except for creatine, which was, I guess they added that to the list of things that you couldn't use after I had got in. So nobody informed me of this. And when I went in front of the judge to get off, she's like, well, you have to take the felony because of your drug screens. Like I hadn't gotten any trouble. I maintained work and all of that stuff. So when I tell her, I'm like, well, I didn't, you know what I'm saying? She's asking me, do I do like what substances do I use and stuff like this. So I'm telling her, like, I was at the time I trained in martial arts. So I'm telling her, like, I trained in martial arts. I work out a little bit. So I use creatine, this and this. And she's like, oh, well, you're not allowed to use creatine because it can mask this and something. So I ended up with my first felony that way. Shortly after that ended, maybe 4 years later, I end up in a situation where I'm in a car with 3 other people and just happened to be in Portsmouth, Ohio, which at the time I didn't know anything about, but I guess it's highly racist. So just to speed the story up, there was no shame in telling us that the reason we were stopped was because there was a black guy riding with a white girl in the front seat, and then myself and another white guy was in the back seat. But they said down there they don't play that, that's not acceptable. To the point where when they dropped me off at the police station, the bailiff told us already that we were going to get railroaded, that we were black from out of town, and it was a drug highway or something. Basically giving us the rundown of what's going on. At the time, I'm thinking like, well, I'm taking it to trial. I didn't do anything. Like, you know, people had already been interrogated. My name had already been cleared. So I ended up sitting 90 days in their county jail with, I had never been fingerprinted. I had a $150,000 bond, which they made cash and surety. So even if I produced $15,000 to get out, I still needed the rest of the money in businesses and houses, which of course I don't know anybody that could put that kind of property up. So we sat in there for a while, and then ultimately I ended up taking a plea deal because what happened in the courtroom, the guy that the two white people were let go. They never were charged. That's the driver and the person in the back of me were never charged. They were sent on about their business. So the other guy was my cousin, and he had told them, and they had a statement from his buddy, which had told on him that they didn't charge, that I was just in the car. I didn't know anything that was going on, and this and that. But what they wanted were for both of us to split up 8 years, or he was going to get 11. So I said, well, we're going to trial. They stood in the courtroom and told me in front of everybody, basically like, it's Portsmouth, we're going to get a conviction. We'll just sentence you to 8 years. And yeah, we don't have anything on you, so you can beat it in appeals, but it's gonna take you about 4 years to do that. So take this 4 years, come home in 2, and come home young enough to raise your family. So at first I fought this because I'm like, I'm not going to prison and everybody's telling you I'm not involved in this and this, but I've also been here 90 days and I've seen this happen over and over and over again. So I think about it. He's like, well, I'm like, come home in 2 years versus do the 4. I know my family doesn't have the money to get a lawyer to appeal. And most of the lawyers from Summit County were scared to come to Portsmouth anyway. So ended up taking a deal, going to prison. And what they didn't explain to me was that because of mandatory sentencing, there's no such thing as coming home in 2 years. I have to do my 2 years, and then I have to wait an additional 6 months because of the mandatory sentence in order for me to even be eligible for a judicial release, which also means that the 90 days that I sat in prison, sat in their county jail, didn't count either towards the 2 years. It had to be 2 years from the day that I hit an actual prison facility. So this was like the first of me recognizing exactly what's going on in the justice system. So I get to prison. Now I'm thinking, okay, I got 4 years over my head. I'm gonna take every program I can to get out. So you got all the little programs that they normally have you take in when you come home from like probation. So you'll do like thinking for a change and the stuff that they give you, like Oriana House and stuff like that. People take these programs, and the challenge in that is just staying woke long enough to get your certificate. So then I started going to college. So because the only reason I really started going to college, I already had a degree, but I had learned that those felonies trumped my college education and my veteran status. Those no longer mattered when it came to applying for a job or even really interviewing. So I started trying to prepare myself as much, like, okay, I'll sign up for apprenticeships and stuff like this. But what people don't understand is once you get to prison, there's a wait list for these programs, and not every prison even offers most of them. Like some people will have to wait 3 to 4 years just to get in the class to take a GED. So the one program I was able to get into was a dog training program. I love dogs. So I said, okay, I sleep with a dog next to my rack for about 2 years straight, just going in and out the apprenticeship. So I finally get my judicial release and come home. So in my mind, I'm saying, okay, I got this dog training. I can go to the pound or something. Somebody will hire me. I'm qualified, this and this. Then I find out in Ohio, you cannot train dogs or work with animals for 3 years after your sentence is over, which means that not from 3 years that I was released from prison, but after I got released off prison, I have an additional 5 years of community control over my head. So once that 5 years is over, 3 years after that, now I can train dogs. So that was out the window. So I'm starting to realize, like, okay, they're talking rehabilitation and correction, but it's really it's a joke. It's something that they're putting out there to look like they're doing something, but they really are setting us up in a way where you are likely to come back 9 times out of 10, because they know when you come home, if with all of these different things in place, and a person is likely to go into survival mode, and they're going to do whatever they know how to do to survive without resources and stuff like that. 9 times out of 10 is going to be whatever got them back. And it's easier to slap a felony on them because they already have this stigma. So now when you go to court, the prosecutor doesn't have to work as hard to paint you to be a bad person or anything like that. So what ended up happening for me was I had a relative that had done work with the Akron Organizing Collaborative, and I was talking to her about some of the things I was interested in, because I started getting interested in like civil rights and just liberation in general, and mainly seeing stuff that people went through in prison, because we tried to start like publishing companies I met so many talented guys that wrote scripts, so we would reach out and try to do this, and ended up some people even caught extra cases because you can't run a business or do anything to that might generate a monetary income while you're incarcerated. At the time, I'm not knowing about the 13th Amendment, so to me, I'm just saying, well, it doesn't make sense because you got people that's trying to lay a foundation so when they go home, they can kind of hit the ground running, so to speak. But they're putting their foot on people's necks and they're stopping all of that. Like I got one buddy now, his book is out, but he had to get transferred to a whole other prison in order for his book to be released. So for me, I was able to get involved with the Akron Organizing Collaborative, and that really is what changed everything for me because I was around people that were from communities like mine that identified with me and what I was going through. Either they done been through it even more than I have, or to some degree where, you know what I'm saying, there wasn't any judgment. Resources were made available. You know what I'm saying? I was able to, I was given a chance to prove myself and show that I was serious about making a change and doing something different. And if I was to slip up or have problems or started going through like the mental challenges or emotional challenges that come out, because you still have to pay child support and your kids still need stuff, and your kids' parents are not usually, the kid's mother is not usually understandable about the situation for too long. So with them, instead of me coming home, at first I was getting job opportunities that were trying to pay $9 an hour, and yet I got to pay child support, court costs, and live my life off of a $300 a week check. So when I came into this community organization, now I'm getting $15 an hour. I'm not worried about how can I eat tomorrow or feed my kids. I was able to maintain housing and still had so everything was good with parole and all of that, but that didn't come from jobs because I got a packet probably this thick when I came home with jobs that hire felons, and most of them didn't. They might hire one or two for their tax write-off, but for the most part, either they didn't hire them or they were jobs that were factory that were high turnarounds anyway, so they just hire anybody that's going to stay for 30 to 90 days. So my real opportunity came from there. And then from working with a community group, I was able to meet other people in the community. It ended up going to other people in the state, to other people in the nation. Like it really got, I was able to see things and do things on a level I'd never had before. So it was easy to keep my morale up. And when things did get hard, to stay focused on something. Like I even ended up getting a platform to launch my book and everything through them.
Yeah,
So my opinion,
sure. I did see that you had that book, a three-part series, a thriller, and I hope people check it out because that's a real story of redemption there. Thank you, Mr. Mathis, for sharing your story, and thank you to Reverend Greene too for sharing your personal stories with us and setting the stage for the rest of tonight's discussion. Please note that they will stick around for the Q&A segment, so please post your questions in the chat box. Next, we're going to listen to our panelists who are going to dig deeper into some of these issues. Tonight, you're going to hear from Robin Turner, a criminal justice organizer with the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, Maria Smith, supervising attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, Perry Clark, president and founder, Truly Reaching You, Inc., also known as TRI, and Mike Randle, executive vice president of operations at Oriana House, Inc. First up is Robin Turner, who is going to share specifically what collateral consequences are and the reentry transition. She will weave in her own story about how those consequences affected her. Robin is an educator, organizer, and humanitarian. Her work supports racial and social equity, social justice movements with a special interest in strategic planning. She has a bachelor's degree in sociology and is currently pursuing a master's degree in education. She is an experienced civic affiliate who serves as president of the ACLU Smart Justice Advisory Board. She holds certificates in chemical dependency counseling and lead contracting. Welcome to the program, Ms. Turner.
Thank you so much. Thank you again for having me. Again, my name is Robin Turner. My pronouns are she, her, hers. What kind of brought me here was that I served 10 years here in Ohio in the carceral system. got caught up on the war on drugs, ended up having to do the time. So I do want to talk about collateral sanctions because collateral sanctions have impacted my life upon doing my time and coming home. So collateral sanctions are state laws and administrative rules that restrict access to jobs, housing, and civic rights for Ohioans with convictions. The Ohio Justice and Policy Center has identified nearly 1,100 collateral sanctions in the Ohio Revised Code. More than 850 of them restrict access to jobs, including more than 250 that restrict employment in specific occupations and 600 that restrict licenses, contracting, and other paths to livelihood. In addition to collateral sanctions defined in law, in practice, businesses screen out candidates with criminal records due to perceived hiring risk. There's also what is called sanctions, vary in severity and triggers within the collateral sanctions. So what this means is sanctions vary in severity, likelihood of being invoked, and the type of crime that triggers them. Some sanctions require use of a background check with no specific bar to employment. If a conviction is found, others bar employment outright or access to a required license. Some sanctions are triggered by funding source, like the administrative rule that says the indictment of any employee for any criminal offense can lead to denial or revocation of a provider's Medicaid contract. Finally, sanctions might be triggered by specific and narrowly defined conviction types, or may be as broad as having any felony conviction. So this is a chart here in regards to basically how we got here. And what this chart actually tells is what happens once the police arrives on the scene, to it being an arrest made, to charges being filed, to being detained pre-trial, which is kind of where the start of the mass incarceration era came in regards to just the pre-trial epidemic, and then case goes to trial. Also, in regards to how we got here, the criminal justice approach over recent decades has expanded the scope of criminalized activities and prioritized punishment over treatment. In Ohio, the prison population has seen a more than threefold increase with no corresponding population growth or surge in crime. These policies have not improved public safety. One reason may be that getting caught in the criminal justice system weakens an individual's chances of making a legitimate living afterward and can trigger a cycle of repeat offenses, often as means of subsistence. Criminal involvement disrupts career and educational paths through the trial process and incarceration that serves existing work relationships or delays school's completion, and later through parole obligations that limit opportunities by making it harder to maintain a regular work or class schedule. Who is affected? Who is affected when it comes to collateral sanctions? An estimated 994,000 Ohioans are living with a felony conviction. Approximately 1 in 11 adults in the state and as many as 1 in 3 adults has a criminal record of some kind. A growing number of Ohioans. The number and share of Ohioans caught up in the criminal justice system has surged over recent decades. Ohio state prison population grew from fewer than 14,000 in 1980 to nearly 50,000 by 2018. Mostly men, but women's share is growing faster as well. Men comprise the vast majority of incarcerated Ohioans, 84.4% in 2016, but women are more likely to be first-time offenders, and the number of incarcerated women grew by 7% between 2014 and 2016. Black Ohioans are 6 times more likely to have a criminal conviction than white Ohioans and are more likely to serve time. In 2017, an estimated 405,000 Black Ohioans had felony convictions, nearly 1 in 4 Black residents. That same year, an estimated 588,000 or 1 in 17 non-Black residents had felony records. Because Black Ohioans are treated so differently by our criminal justice system, collateral sanctions fall more heavily on Black communities. They can steer Black Ohioans to the bottom of the workforce or lock them out of jobs altogether. Barring job candidates on the basis of a conviction can even amount to racial discrimination. Also, who's affected is the least educated Ohioans, and criminal justice involvement can disrupt education. Educational attainment rates are lower among incarcerated Ohioans than the general population. In 2013, 37.7% of Ohioans admitted to Ohio prisons never finished high school, compared to 10.5% of the over 25 statewide population. A negative feedback loop exists between educational attainment and incarceration. Once incarcerated, options to continue educational attainment are limited. Following release, many jobs requiring training and education are barred by collateral sanctions, which provides a disincentive for continued education. Ohioans with a drug charge. Drug-related crimes constitute 25.5% of all felonies resulting in prison sentence in Ohio in 2014. Drug convictions accounted for 38.9% of all Ohio women sent to prison in 2015 and 25% of men. Drug offenses were the most common reason for women and the second most common reason for men to be sent to prison after crimes against persons. While opioids get substantial attention due to their growing use and potentially catastrophic health impact, marijuana possession exceeded incidents for all other drugs combined and grew by 72.5%. Drug addiction can compromise job performance if a drug is used at or before work, yet it is difficult to justify exclusion from work over minor drug possession on safety grounds. This is an area where sanctions are likely overly expansive. So this is the part where I would actually just interject and talk a little bit about myself in regards to the process that I went through. So upon being released from prison, it was a process called pre-release. And what pre-release was, it kind of prepared you to, you know, come out and housing and jobs and things of that nature. So upon me being released, I left prison. I went to the Oriana house on 55th in Cleveland. I did 45 days in the Oriana house here in the city of Cleveland. Went home after 45 days with the ankle monitor. Let me backtrack a little bit. While in the Oriana house, the first pass I got, I actually got a job. I started working for DirecTV. I was on parole. I want to say I made it off of parole within, I want to say 8 months to a year, just because of how well I did in regards to me transitioning home with my girls. In regards to my record expunged in the ceiling, when I even attempted to have my record expunged and sealed, because my felonies are felonies 1s and 2s, I was actually told that I wasn't qualified just because of the levels of my felony offenses. In regards to housing, I know initially when I first came home, I did stay with my mom, maybe for about 8 months. Housing at some point it was a barrier for me because even on the housing applications, you know, they ask you different questions in regards to your background. So maybe when I was out, probably after 2 years, I ended up just purchasing my own home so I wouldn't have to go through the process in regards to answering that question about my background and my past. For me, employment has never actually really been a barrier for me because I've always been able to go into a job and sell myself. And then while I was in prison, I actually got my associate's degree. I came home and finished up my bachelor's degree. So I was always able to sell myself educationally. On paper, I look really bad, but in person, it's a total different story. Family reunification. So one of my main goals and my main agenda was to come home and, you know, get acclimated with my daughters, start rebuilding those relationships with schools, doctors, daycares, and things of that nature. I did that. And even through the process, I started going through different leadership development programs to develop myself, just in regards to what I needed to do and what needs to happen for me moving forward so I wouldn't have to return to prison. So now I'm at a point in my life, upon me coming home, I was surviving because I just didn't know in regards to what may have to happen, what did or didn't happen in regards to potentially taking me back. But because I followed the process and went through the process, by the grace of God, I never had to look back and go back. And today I'm like 8 courses away from my master's in education because I always said that I wanted to master education to be able to reach back and teach the ones who are left behind in the carceral system, you know, whether it's throughout the state or, you know, here in the city of Cleveland. So that's kind of like my story.
Thank you so much, Ms. Turner, for sharing your story. And that was an enlightening presentation. Another quick fact, think about this for a minute. 1.4 million children have a parent in prison. That shows the impact on families. Our next panelist is going to talk about housing. Maria Smith is the supervising attorney for the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. Maria is well known throughout the community for her leadership efforts and work advocating for the needs of the politically, economically, and socially disadvantaged in the greater Cleveland area. Maria is the recipient of Lutheran Hospital's 2015 Community Service Award. She also was featured on the cover of the July 2015 issue of the American Lawyer. Thank you for joining us tonight, Ms. Smith.
Thank you for having me. I'm almost moved to tears. It's such a privilege to be here to hear the stories that Ray and Walter and Robin have gone through. It makes me even more motivated to get rid of this scourge and what I'm calling a never-ending sentence. I want to put an end to the never-ending sentence. Housing is been like, it has a lot of intersectionality. And so one of the problems about mass incarceration and housing is that the history of discrimination against African Americans for housing has a long history sanctioned by the federal government. And it has excluded African Americans from the one tool that the middle class in the United States uses for wealth building. And so African Americans already were a step behind, add the layer of, or 10 steps behind, add the layer of mass incarceration. And you have what we are setting up now for people to not have a place to go back to recidivate. So the part one, the professor did a great job of explaining some of the linkages between this issue and the history of discrimination. But in housing, it's particularly important because it was designed to exclude African Americans. And it's, even though we have laws that the Fair Housing Act was to stop the discrimination of African Americans and other protected classes from being prohibited from obtaining housing, it never remedied the past history of discrimination. So next slide, please. So these effects of unfair housing policies play into all of the
It seems like we have
your health, your wealth, all of those things. So next slide, please. This is the quote saying we have to remedy what happened in the past to move forward. Next slide, please. So a group of reentry advocates, we wanted to try to quantify what is the impact that a felony conviction has on people that are applying for project-based Section 8 housing. The reason why we picked project-based Section 8 housing is because it's quote affordable, because its income rent is calculated based on income. And two, because we actually could gather the tenant selection plans. So we looked at this, and as you can see, these are the number of housing providers that we surveyed their tenant selection plans. And a felony was an absolute bar. That's why we put 99 years. A felony was an absolute bar for getting your application accepted. What we didn't know was the next slide, is misdemeanor. And they're never counseled about the collateral consequence, which is different than a collateral sanction. They're never counseled about how this ongoing thing can happen in the private sector, even though you just, quote unquote, have a misdemeanor. Next slide, please. So given all this, there are over 100 million people in the United States that have some kind of criminal background. So that's a lot of white people that are impacted. but the disparate impact on African Americans is really great. So in 2015, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case called Inclusive Communities that you could use an analysis of disparate impact to litigate a fair housing claim. It was the opening of a door to give us some hope that we may be able to get a legal hinge that never existed in housing, but did exist in employment. Now, this is big data, so it's not really that significant for each individual, but if you analyze data collectively and can come up with neutral rules that have a disparate impact, then the Fair Housing Act comes into play. So in 2016, HUD issued a guidance saying that because of disparate impact, you absolutely cannot use arrest as a bar, and you absolutely cannot use blanket criminal convictions. So most landlords don't have blanket criminal convictions. They select crimes that they're going to piece and part, which crime and how long it's going to keep you out. Next slide, please. So the guidance says that a landlord must have a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory reason for having a criminal conviction as a bar. Next slide, please. But the guidance also says that even if the landlord can show a substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory reason, the landlord must give an applicant for housing an opportunity to show a least restrictive alternative. So a landlord should give people an individualized assessment. So you go in, you tell your story, you show how you can be a good tenant. Until recently, there was no empirical data that showed anything about why criminal convictions should keep someone out. There was just nothing. And now we have data that shows criminal convictions have no correlation with how successful you are as a tenant for the most part. So there are some criminal convictions that there's a small association, but nothing that's conclusive that says any criminal conviction should be the blanket reason why a person should be kept out. Next slide, please. So I wanted to get to the, we can skip this slide. I wanted to get to the aspirational parts. So one of the things that I was trying to say is that our law the scaffolding has been weak. So really, and the scaffolding is weak in the whole housing context. So instead of recognizing housing as a human right, which is where we should do because no one can survive without housing, instead we have very weak legal scaffolding. But we also have communities that have been aspiring to build a scaffolding to protect people that are reentering into communities. And those laws are called fair chance housing ordinances. And so we've had the new recent example of New Jersey that just passed a fair chance housing statute. And then we have this long list of ordinances that have been passed in various places. Seattle, one of the leaders, they have a very comprehensive ordinance and it has built in an evaluation piece. So this is something that communities can aspire to. They also have built in so that landlords are prohibited from even asking the question, checking off a box, so that because it's irrelevant, it shouldn't keep people out of housing initially. Then landlords are able to vet for certain kinds of crimes if they can show legitimate, substantial, non-discriminatory reasons, which is almost impossible. Next slide, please. So I want to invite those that are dealing with housing decisions and denials to contact the Fair Housing Center for Rights and Research, which lots of reentry groups partner with. If you're finding that a private landlord has denied you because of a criminal background, and to contact the Legal Aid Society, particularly if you're finding that you've been denied housing for some HUD assisted or federally subsidized or public housing authority. I want to say that if we use our imaginations, we can build a world where everyone gets housing, and it definitely will decrease the number of people that recidivate. and it will increase the quality of life for many children and many families, because reentry doesn't just impact the person that gets caught up in the criminal justice system, but it impacts all of those families. So if you think of 100 million people that have some kind of criminal background, think of all the lives that has touched. These are just final slides of who legal aid serves. And if you skip to the final slide, I want to just tell us that Bell Hooks is, what we want to do is build a beloved community, and a beloved community means that everyone has housing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Smith, for that presentation. That was a great one on housing and what that impact is on formerly incarcerated people. We're moving on quickly to our next panelist, who's going to talk about training, employment, and stability. Perry Clark was born and raised in inner city Akron. Perry understands the city and the ways of the street. He also understands the hardship that men face when re-entering the community after being incarcerated himself. In 1999, Perry founded Truly Reaching You, Inc., also known as TRI. He trained and employed men returning to the community through his private business, Common Investor Home Remodeling. Perry opened TRI's first transitional home in 2006, housing men in a healthy support system directly after prison. Today, there are 7 houses housing 28 men in a holistic program. Married with 5 children and 14 grandchildren, Perry has the heart, experience, and resources to help others surrender their old lifestyles and reunite with their families and communities. He serves as a board member for several organizations on recovery and housing. Mr. Clerk, over to you. Do we have Mr. Clerk there?
Okay, here I go. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Once again, I was incarcerated for 10 years. And how could I be of help to those coming back to the community who I understood coming back in community? I would, during that time of incarceration, I didn't think I should have been incarcerated. I think I was incarcerated because I was a Black man. I was a Black man that parents wasn't wealthy. It was my first conviction, and so I went on. So when I came back to the community, how could I be of help to those returning to the community? How could I make a difference in the community that I once was raised in and now live in? So I started off with the idea of helping 3 men who I watched go home from prison multiple times and left me there. I reached out to them and said, I want to help you get off this corner. What I learned that them 3 men, none of them had a skill and did not have a skill to learn how to work. And I had a skill in the background of construction. So I reached out to them. If you'll stay clean, allow me a urine test you, I'll give you a job. It worked out wonderful. 2 of the men today are still living in Akron and are home owners today. So Truly Reaching You, as you stated, was founded in 1999, and we work with those coming back to the community, providing a healthy support housing system for them. You know, a lot of times we think the first thing they need when they come back to the community is a job and a house. First thing, I think they do need a house, a place to live that's safe. But the second, what they're missing is a healthy support system for engagement, to change their old ways of thinking and their old ways of living. So, so through that, how do we help make that change when they come back? They come back with only the clothes on their backs. So we take them out and we provide for them everything they need, clothing, all of the hygienes, a safe place to live. As she stated, we have house 28 men in 7 houses. They need their own bedroom, not the shared bedroom. 5 men, 5-bedroom house, 5 men, 3-bedroom house, 3 men. How do we embrace them in God's love? And so as we move forward, all our houses, they learn a trade in construction, commercial lawn care and residential lawn care, as well as commercial cleaning. And we have companies have came along to help us with this endeavor, providing them with jobs once they leave our program, because they call us and say, do you got anybody who completed the program? Because now they know that we just spent a year with them or longer, and we know them. And so they walk through us. And so we have seen men who's registered sex offenders who have did 25 years for murder, get jobs, employment. But it's through building relationships. Okay. When I came back to the community, it wasn't nothing like this. So that's what made me get started of how can I help someone. I thought I would help 3 men and been stuck for 20 plus years now, but it's been all right. It's been a good start. But we look back and I think about the interaction with the men. Many of the men come back to lost loved ones who then passed on, no relationship with their children. So we embrace them, bring them into a new family and embrace them. We are a faith-based organization through Christ. And, you know, our first 10 years was tough. My first 10 years of doing this was tough. What made it so tough was nobody was believing me, other than my lovely wife. She gave me the ideal that you can use that money that you have saved and made from your private company to do truly reaching you. So in 2007, I shut my private company down because I was spending too much time away from her. So I shut my private company down and used her. She gave me her blessing to go ahead and move forward. The first 3 houses we purchased ourselves to help men. We went 10 years before we applied for the first grant. We are 501c3. I went 10 years before we applied for the first grant because people who I met said they wanted to help from some foundations and large organizations, but I just believe they did not believe a Black man was behind this and it's not gonna stand. I just honestly believe that. On my 11th, we went 10 years before we applied for a grant. The 11th year I applied for a grant. I walked in a foundation through a mutual friend who got me in the door. And the gentleman says to me, the president of that foundation said to me, wow, where have you been? And I said, I've been in this community for the last 11 years doing this work. What do you mean where I've been? He said, well, you never asked nobody for no money. We never heard of you. And I said, okay, where did you get money to do this? My background is construction. I had a company for profit and I used my own money with the blessing of my wife. My wife is an RN, and now a retired RN, but she allowed me to use my money. He ordered, 3 hours later, he called me and said, we're gonna honor you and give you a grant. And he gave us that grant. And 2 weeks later, I'll never forget, he called and he wanted a meeting with me. And I said, why do you want a meeting? And he said, because I want to learn more about what you're doing. How can I be of help? So there we go. Many people who turned me down during the first 9, 10 years have now, in the last 5, 6 years, have now called and asked, hey, how can I be of help? I take that back to believing that, and I wholeheartedly believe that I have my first hire was a white gentleman, Steve Weaver. He was my first hire 15 years ago. And he would say to me, if I was in your shoes and you was in my shoes, you would have got money early. He said, it's just simple. I just know they would have gave you money if I would have did what you did. If I went to prison for 10 years and come back, they would have helped you, the community. So we get to laugh about that. Today we have 20 employees. 20 employees, 50% of them came through the program. Men who came through the program and who believe that they was gonna never make it. I know 9 men who came through, 11 men who come through the program are now homeowners here in the city of Akron. and one lady. We work strictly with men. At one time, we did work with ladies for 2 years, and I wasn't called. We hired someone I knew wanted to work with ladies, and I said, you could do it. And she decided to leave, and I said, when you leave, we will no longer do ladies. There's one lady in the program in a house, and we ended up getting a house for her and selling it to her. And in 2025, she hasn't missed a payment since 2017 and 2025. Her house will be paid for. Total remodeled home. So that's who Truly Reaching You is. And how do we continue to help those who come back to the community? We are the only one that will work with a registered sex offender, or a registered arson. We're the only program in Summit County that will provide housing to them. I believe everyone is deserving of a second chance.
Yeah, and that's what it's all about, a second chance. Yeah, I like what you said about building relationships because of our time. I think that is really important. Thank you so much, Mr. Clark, for that insightful presentation. We will have some questions for you at the end of this program. So our final panelist tonight will talk about alternative programs and services and bail reform. Mike Randle is the Executive Vice President of Operations for Oriana House. His career in corrections spans more than 30 years, with nearly 20 years at the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, where he served in a variety of positions. At Oriana, Mike is responsible for the overall operation and management of residential, non-residential, and diversionary community corrections programs, including cognitive skills, treatment, employment, and education programming. He also oversees the development and implementation of new programs. Mike received his bachelor's degree in criminology from The Ohio State University and his MBA from Ashland University. He is a member of several organizations, including the American Correctional Association and National Association of Blacks in Criminal. Mr. Randle, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Before I get started, I did want to take a moment. Both Ray and Walter referred to their experiences with Oriana House as jokes. And let me first start off by saying, until you make the decision that you want to change yourselves, and I applaud both Ray and Walter for making that decision, until you make the decision that you want to change, no program will be effective. That's been my experience over 30 plus years, working with offenders at all levels, from low-level offenders in the community to offenders on death row. Until you make the decision that you want to change your life, then programs, drug treatment, all of the alternatives and opportunities become available to you. I couldn't help but feel, I guess a sense of concern about Ray and saying, no wonder when Ray described the pressures that he was under with his kids and selling drugs and trying to do, no wonder programs were not effective, because you weren't prepared at that moment. And so what we try to do is provide the opportunity for people to change. And that's what this organization is all about. So let me start off by just real quickly. Oriana House has been around for over 40 years, started off in Summit County and has expanded over the years, providing rehabilitative services and programs. We currently have operations in Cuyahoga, Summit, North Central Ohio. You can see the map as far north as Sandusky and as far south as Marietta. We can go to the next slide. We primarily provide chemical dependency treatment services as well as community correction services. By community correction services, I try to use this continuum of sanctions as a way to explain to people how things work. If you look at the top of this sanction model, if prison and jail are the most restrictive sanctions available to the criminal justice system. Where we try to provide services is at that level of community-based correctional facilities, halfway houses, restricted halfway houses, day reporting, day treatment programs. Those kinds of things are what we focus on as an organization. We provide integrated rehabilitation services for people. And the thing we try to get across to criminal justice system partners is looking at the right sanction for the right person at the right moment. In other words, making sure that we use the least restrictive sanction and give a person the opportunity to address whatever issues that brought them in front of the criminal justice system, whether it be the courts, whether it be probation, whether it be prisons. And the way we do that is by doing risk and needs assessments. If you're in Ohio and work in the criminal justice system at any level, you're familiar with the risk assessment, the ORAS. Those are tools that we use to look at what the potential risk of reoffending, what pro-social attributes a person may have, and try to come up with alternatives to address whatever issues need to be dealt with in terms of that particular person. And so we can go to the next slide. It's no longer a one-size-fits-all approach. A lot of our programs are at different levels. At the top left-hand center, you see the Huff Center, which is on East 55th in Lexington and Cleveland, Ohio. We provide day reporting services there. On the bottom left, you see the Frederick Street apartments. That is a recovery housing location that we have where people in recovery can have an apartment where they can, and it's entirely focused on sober living. Is staffed there by what we call recovery coaches. These are people that have lived the recovery experience, and they're there to work with those individuals and get case management services. Across the bottom, you see a halfway house in one of our day reporting centers. We can go to the next slide, as well as our community-based correctional facilities. Again, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, and that's our approach. We try to meet people where they are, understanding that not everyone is ready to change at a particular moment. The good news is we welcome people back. In fact, in the case of Ray, I invited Ray in to come and talk to residents at our facilities during this last election to talk about voter issues and things like that. So we continue to try to make acts accessible, people that have gone on and got around those issues and become productive people out there doing positive things, because Ray's message resonates with our population in a lot of cases, more so than somebody like me talking about rehabilitation and those kinds of things. And so we often work towards that. We can go to the next slide. Again, we focus on more than just COG skills, more than just treatment. We try to introduce our clients into what we call pro-social activities, where they can do leisure activities and learn things that they can do with their kids, like urban gardening and ideas with making items from sewing and things like that, computer skills, all those kinds of things. We can go to the next slide. One of the things that is very unique that we are in partnership with the Cuyahoga County Office of Reentry is the North Star Neighborhood Reentry Resource Center. This is a welcoming center for anyone leaving jail or prison. It's a one-stop location where somebody who has recently been released can come and have access to all sorts of social service agencies in the Huff neighborhood and beyond to get assistance with everything from education to AA and NA meetings to college courses to job skills. They can have a meeting with their PO rather than having to travel downtown. Their satellite PO offices where they can do check-ins there, those kinds of things. It is highly utilized, and it's basically a welcoming center for people who have been in an incarcerate setting where they can come and kind of get a leg up and get started at the North Star Reentry Resource Center. We can go to the next slide. Again, one of the things that we are most proud of is we've partnered with the Cleveland Muni Court to help with some of their bail reform initiatives. And we provide supervision services to a lot of individuals that are on bail and they don't have to pay that bond. And we're responsible for contacting those individuals, reminding them of their court date, checking in with them, connecting them with services while they're waiting a disposition of their cases. And we're very proud of the fact that you would be surprised how a simple text message, a check-in, a call to an individual, reminding them of a court date, that goes a long way in terms of reminding the person to show up, letting them know that there's somebody willing to go there with them to that court appearance, and just make sure that they're doing the things that they need to do in terms of meeting the conditions. And 80% of the people in that program show up to their court dates. So in terms of the bail reform movement, we think this is one of the things that works well and can provide an opportunity for people to not languish in jail, but rather be at home with their families and do the things that they need to do to get the appropriate disposition of their cases. Again, I know time is short, so I wanted to make sure that I went through these items, and I also wanted to make sure that I had an opportunity to, again, address the issues that were raised by both Ray and Walter. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Randle, and a big thank you to all our panelists tonight for those packed presentations. Right now, we're moving to an important part of tonight's program, which is the question and answer segment. So this is the time to answer questions from you, our audience, and we do have a lot of questions in the bank. So we're gonna start off. We have a question about funding, actually 2 questions, but since Mr. Randle was the last speaker, I'm gonna ask, is the funding for Oriana House through the state? And then I also have the same question for Ms. Turner about the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, but Mr. Randle first.
Oriana House receives funding from the state, as well as county, as well as muni, as well as federal. So we receive several funding sources. We apply for grants, we apply for opportunities to provide these services, yes.
Awesome. Ms. Turner, how about the Ohio Organizing Collaborative? How is that funded?
I want to say that's funded through different grants and different funders. I'm not quite sure in regards to money from the state, but I know it is funded through different grants and different private funders.
Awesome. Okay, so going on to the next question. Are job recruiters allowed to ask if a person has a criminal record? So I would like Reverend Greene, if you can answer that question. And if any of the panelists want to respond to any of the questions, please feel free to do that. But Reverend Greene, if you want to take that question, are job recruiters allowed to ask for a person's criminal records?
In 2016 and 2017, we successfully organized in the state of Ohio and in several municipalities, Akron, Dayton, Cleveland, Youngstown, and Canton, that ensures that the state of Ohio and city employment can no longer ask you, have you been convicted of a felony, until they offer you a job. For private companies, they are still allowed to ask you, have you been convicted of a felony? But no state or city or county government job can longer ask you that until they offer you a job. And then after they offer you a job, your felony has to be related to that job. So if you get a job, if you're applying for a job in the finance department, but you got fraud on your record, they could deny you that job. But if you're applying for a construction job to do the sewers and you have a fraud, that fraud doesn't affect you digging ditches in the sewer. So the crime has to fit the job description to be disqualified.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Mathis, I have a question for you. Employers right now, we've heard about them looking for workers, and they're supposedly starved for workers. Is this a major opportunity for re-entry citizens?
I personally probably would say no, because they need employment across the board. So depending on the job, say for example, a situation I went through, I went to go, like in reference to what Ray was saying, I got offered a $60,000 job. They never asked me about it or anything, and then I interviewed well, so they gave me the job. And then in the process of filling out the paperwork, come to find out you can't sell insurance as a felon in Ohio. So these, I think collateral sanctions and legislation kind of take it out of the hands of employers, even if they do want to hire felons in certain situations.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Clark, it seems like you wanted to say something. You're muted. You are muted, please. Mr. Clark, can you unmute? We can hear you. Okay. So I do have a question for you, Mr. Clark. It's a 2-in-1 question that was submitted. So someone wants to know how many men have been trained in your program, the TRI program, and you kind of touched on this a little. Is there a TRI program for women or something like that? Can you unmute yourself, please? Okay, maybe we'll come back to those questions.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. No, there's a program being developed now for women to answer that question. I still believe they're months away, but someone is working in Summit County to develop a program that I'm working with. So we do about 50 to 60 men a year come through our program. Back to what Mr. Randle have said, one gotta want to make a change moving forward. So that's why we average stay is a full stay is a year, but we don't have to stay longer. Also, I wanted to answer the question back concerning employment that Mr. Mathis was speaking to.
Please do.
I believe what happened, that people would get hired. We've been getting a phone call. We had 3 today in the office. So for the past 45, 50 days, we get a call nearly every day from people calling, asking if we could replenish men in our program. During this pandemic, our numbers had even been down for the past 18 months during this pandemic we've been in. But I think people, whether they know us, many of them companies I never heard of who's been calling to heard of us. So I think there would be they need manpower. So they would hire, there is an opportunity for that.
Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Smith. Is there a shortage of affordable housing for ex-felons, and what is being done to remedy that?
Well, there's a shortage of affordable housing for everyone. That's part of the problem. And yes, so the answer is yes, because there's a shortage of affordable housing. And so I'm really admiring these programs that allow people to learn how to build houses and, to purchase houses. The irony is that if you go to a bank, they don't ask you about your criminal background when you buy a house. And really what we're striving to do with rental housing is to also say, if I'm if I'm bankable in a tenancy, then what does it matter what happened before? And that's what banks that's the way banks approach it. So that's what we are aspiring to create for people.
Thank you. So back to Mr. Randle, circling back to bail reform, what will be the fastest things to accomplish short term?
The fastest thing to accomplish in terms of bail reform?
Yes, please.
I think in fact, the Supreme Court just issued some guidance that I would reference. In March, the Ohio Supreme Court made 2 rulings that'll take place effective July 1. The first one is counties should establish as their first choice release of an individual on personal recognizance before resorting to formal bail. In other words, consider the opportunity for a person to be released on personal recognizance rather than requiring formal bail. That should be the first thing that they consider. The second ruling that they made was that counties with more than one municipal or county court should adopt a uniform bail structure. Those 2 rulings go into effect July 1, and I think those two items will have an impact. In terms of the level of impact, I don't know, but certainly it will put us on the road. So.
Okay, that's good to know. So Ms. Turner, I have a question for you. What are the greatest collateral consequences or sanctions in Northeast Ohio, talking about Cuyahoga, Summit, Portage counties, and where have improvements been made?
You said, what are the greatest collateral consequences?
Mm-hmm.
So I think I'm gonna speak for myself and use an eye for myself. Some of the greatest, upon me being released, some of the greatest collateral sanctions for myself have been when I came home finding being able to make a living wage just because of my background. Now, I never had an issue with finding a job. It was just a job that was going to be able to pay enough so I don't have to go get another job. Housing. So I went from an apartment with my mom to another apartment. So I was going apartment to apartment, hoping that they wouldn't ask my background, or that I knew someone that knew a little bit about my background but knew me as a person. So it was housing, finding a job where I can actually make a livable wage. Yeah, and that's what it actually was for me. Just that, and just that.
Yeah, those were some big issues you mentioned there. So I have a question for any one of the panelists who wants to answer this. How are reentry programs changing, and what have we learned that actually works? How are reentry programs changing, and what have we learned that works?
I can try to address that. I think from my perspective, what we're finding out is, these cookie cutter programs, they need to be less about cookie cutter and more meeting people where they are. And that's number one. I think number two, more importantly, if you look at the impact of the last 15 to 18 months, and specifically COVID's impact on the criminal justice system, it has been profound in the sense that there are less people incarcerated in Ohio. As of today, there are about 43,000 people in prisons across the state. Just 2 years ago, that number was 49,000. And so the impact of courts not being open as often, the impact of lower jail populations and prison populations, I think it gives all of us an opportunity to work closer with people to try to keep them out. As courts begin to open up again, I think programs need to be designed to try to keep people more local, to address that sanction continuum that I gave you an example of, but keeping people closer to home, whatever pro-social attributes, if they have a job, try to work with them to keep that job, but issue a local sanction where they can maintain that. Those are opportunities now that I think we have. And I think the second thing I would say is technology. We've all learned that technology has, we can do a lot more with technology by way of having check-ins over Zoom with people that are under supervision. And I think a lot of those things will continue and stay even post-COVID.
I wanted to also piggyback on something that kind of a different angle, but what I've seen over the last 15 years that I've been involved in it is that I think programs are listening more to people that have lived experience. And that's really what we need to do. And more people are connecting the dots with structural racism, because until we get an understanding about how the system is constructed for this to happen, even though individuals might make different choices in their life, there's still going to be a system that funnels them into this pipeline. And so that's the change that I think has been most positive from my perspective. And Judge Adrian's report was in 1996, and I really thought the judiciary would move forward in understanding implicit bias, and it's only now coming to fruition. So I think that that's really going to move us a little bit faster, forward faster.
I want to add on to that. I will add on that there's two things that needs to happen. First thing is we need to start pushing more money into programs like TRI, where a formerly incarcerated person is able to make that connection and guide people down the road to ultimately prosperity and independence. But then on the front end, what we got to do is ultimately begin to phase off the reentry process. It began to take care of some of these issues on the front end. 90% of the people in prison are there for either economic reasons or mental health reasons. And those things can be covered on the front end if we start with mental health care in the elementary schools and begin to give people mental health care earlier and then provide a living wage. We would get rid of most of the crime that we have to where we won't even need a reentry process. But right now we're in a hamster wheel of structural racism that this is never going to end because people are getting paid off of this system.
Right. Mr. Clark, I think you wanted to say
something. I did want to say something, but I believe the last two speakers just said all that needs to be said. That's where I was going. And, we need to look at those who has been in the grassroots, is doing the work in the mission field out here to make change. But they have said it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists for all the great work that you do and for answering those great questions that we had. Now that we've heard from our panelists, we're going to tell you how you can transform talk into action. For that, we go to Liz King, who is the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair for the League of Women Voters of Akron. Over to you, Liz.
Thank you, Foluke. After hearing our presenters tonight, I imagine each of us feels somewhat overwhelmed and also, however, must feel a need to make a difference. We've heard how the unfair cash bail system hurts so many individuals and families, as well as our entire communities. Take action now on bail reform in Ohio by letting your legislators know you support House Bill 315, Senate Bill 182 bail reform. Don't try to click on your screen. A link is in the chat function. So if you go in the chat, you'll find the link and it will take you to your individual legislators. It will send a message urging them to support these bills. Our second take action relates specifically to last week's part 1, examining the courts. We heard experienced testimony for the need to ensure representative, fair, and nonpartisan judges. Senate Bill 80, House Bill 149, would require certain judicial candidates to appear on the ballot with a party designation. Click again on the chat function, then on the link to send a message to your legislators asking them to oppose passage of these bills. Our next take action is closer to home. In developing these programs, next slide, please. In developing these programs, it became apparent how enormous the challenge is for returning citizens after involvement in the court system. Through our research, we have compiled a listing of relevant comprehensive resources. A link has been added to the chat area for your information and future use. This is a working document, and we will add and amend where necessary. The action for this is we are urging everyone to support these vital organizations, agencies, and businesses. Engage with your time, expertise, financial support, and patronize the establishments where possible. Each provides an invaluable service. An addition for your information, the League of Women Voters of Ohio has launched a statewide criminal justice study. League members and non-members are invited to join in developing this study. In the chat is an email, which will give you more information. We want to thank our important partners again, shown on your screen, for their invaluable assistance and support in presenting this program. The leagues of the Akron area, Greater Cleveland, Hudson, and Kent produce Real Talk series. We welcome your participation and interest. Please consider joining us in our efforts. Learn more about our leagues and more about our partners by clicking on the links in the chat. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to our skillful moderator, Foluke Omosun. You can follow her reporting on WKSU. Very special thanks to our outstanding participants this evening. You've added to our understanding and deep appreciation through your stories and the services you provide. Foluke? Foluke, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Thank you again to our panel and to you for your questions and attendance. Just a reminder, everyone will be emailed the recording and list of resources, and all of this material will be uploaded to the Real Talk website at realtalklwv.org. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful evening.